Prologue. "Victoria is on her way," Mr. Joseph Maxwell said in a hushed voice, as his deep-set green eyes betrayed both apprehension and excitement. A man of average stature, but of slender form, he had broad shoulders, freckle-covered sunken cheeks, and high cheekbones. His distinctive red hair was neatly combed and parted to the left. An apprentice journalist with the Gaslight Gazette newspaper, he had an overall well-turned-out appearance. This consisted of a black frock coat over a dark grey waistcoat, accompanied by a high-collared white shirt and black silk cravat. The last had its tiny bow tied over his Adam's apple. The scents of lavender and carbolic soap lingered around him. When his two companions reacted with a mere polite smile and a subtle nod, though, he rested his clasped hands upon the table and twisted around in his chair. He watched as the waitress carried sliced Victoria sponge cake to a couple sitting on the opposite side of the crowded tea room. He wore the respectable attire of a middle-class gentleman, while she was adorned in a burgundy bustle dress and feather-topped hat which mimicked the fashion worn by ladies of a similar class. Both were in their 20s, despite the fact his brown hair was duller than her blonde, and both were around 5 feet 9 inches tall. Rubbing his thumbs together, an ache in Mr. Maxwell's back then obliged him to face his companions once more. The tea room was housed above a branch of the Aerated Bread Company, with its only access being a set of stairs leading from the rear of the ground floor shop. Located on the Euston Road, the A.B.C. tea room, as it had come to be known, was a favoured refreshment stop for many a Londoner. Northbound travellers on their way to the London and North Western Railway's Euston Square terminus were also daily regulars. Due to its popularity, there was often a queue down the stairs, yet the staff could be relied upon to clear the tables discreetly and efficiently, thus ensuring one was seated in no time at all. A 4-foot-high counter faced the door with a tin sign affixed to its front announcing all customers must inquire here. To its left was a tall, wooden-framed display cabinet containing a vast array of delectable goods, including freshly baked aerated bread loaves and scones. In addition to allowing one to see what was on offer, the cabinet's glass panes also protected the goods from being contaminated by the bad smells of the city and germs. The remainder of the room's furniture consisted of ebony tables covered by white tablecloths and high-backed chairs with firm, dark green cushions. With regards to decor, exposed floorboards preferred over carpets due to the high rate of footfall the tea room experienced. The walls, meanwhile, were papered with a dark green, curving plant design on a slightly lighter green background. The low winter sun poured in through sash windows, adding to the already welcoming glow of the wall-mounted gas lamp sconces. Their sashes were opened to provide the reassurance of fresh air from the street, thereby negating a customer's concerns about the possible build-up of carbonic gas. "Are they the couple we're waiting for?" Mr. Maxwell inquired. "Miss Dexter, may I see your sketches again?" Miss Georgina Dexter offered a gentle smile and pulled her satchel onto her lap. From it she took 2 drawings, the first of a male, the second of a female. Her posture remained impeccable as she held them across the table to him. At only 5 feet tall, she was considerably shorter than he, yet her petite form was nevertheless in perfect proportion. There was also an age difference of 3 years between them, with her being the younger at 18. Like him, she was fair-skinned with red hair. Hers was 2 shades darker and several inches longer than his though, and kept tightly pinned beneath a midnight blue bonnet with black edging. The plain, straight-line dress she wore matched the bonnet in colour. With her entire chest and part of her neck covered by its material, Miss Dexter felt as comfortable as she could in the company of 2 bachelors, neither of whom she courted. "Yeah," Dr. Percy Weeks replied. His Canadian accent was in stark contrast to those of his English companions. Unlike them, he was slouched with his head leant back and his hands resting upon the backs of their chairs. A lit cigarette, perched in the corner of his mouth, bobbed as he exhaled smoke in their direction and warned, "So stop gawking at 'em." Miss Dexter pressed a handkerchief to her mouth as she coughed, whilst Mr. Maxwell crumpled his nose and moved his head back. "Don't know why I'm here anyway." "I must agree with you, Doctor," Miss Dexter thought. The man reeked of liquor and, despite being in the tea room, had refused to purchase a cup, citing the fact he didn't drink such shit, and much preferred coffee. As if hearing her thoughts, he retrieved a silver flask from his overcoat and took a swallow of Scotch whisky without a hint of shame. Her concern regarding his Bow Street Society membership, born from behaviour of this kind, wasn't of real note, however, when one considered his affiliation with the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard. Yes, police officers were often exposed as drunks, but Dr. Weeks was allegedly a man of medicine, one upon whom the Yard relied, or so she was told. It left her feeling utterly bewildered whenever she tried to fathom how such a man as he could be granted such great responsibility. Aside from his vulgar choice of vocabulary, lack of manners, and a distinct accent, Dr. Weeks's other remarkable traits could be said to be short, slick-backed hair, small, waxed moustache, and long, short-haired sideburns, all of which were jet black. The fine quality of his attire, meanwhile, was in blatant contradiction to his behaviour. A dark green, tailor-made three-piece suit was accompanied by a matching tie with gold pin, and a white shirt with starched collar. His knee-length black overcoat hung from the back of his chair, whilst a black felt trilby sat upon the table. At 29, he was the eldest of the three. Miss Trent said we'd need a doctor when Miss Johnson faints, Mr. Maxwell said. His words pulled Miss Dexter back from her thoughts, and she offered him another smile as she rested her charcoal-smudged hands in her lap. Though he had seen the sketches earlier, she was reluctant to point this out when he studied them for a second time. She seems to know what she's doing, Mr. Maxwell added. Miss Trent, that is. But the damn thing's out of sight, Dr. Weeks growled, pulling the sketches from Mr. Maxwell's grip and tossing them back to Miss Dexter. Jesus. He shook his head. Sorry, Mr. Maxwell muttered as he felt his cheeks grow hot and his mouth turn dry. Miss Dexter quietly cleared her throat and slid the sketches back into her satchel. Miss Trent's instructions, to me, were to watch Miss Johnson and Mr. Eddowes, and to only act when the time is right. She cast an awkward glance between them as she lifted her teacup to her lips. I intend to do that. The scrape of a chair against the floor then pulled their attention back to the young couple. Miss Johnson was doubled over with her face contorted in pain as she gripped her corseted stomach with a lace-clad hand. Upon seeing this, a passing waitress stopped at once to inquire, "Are you unwell, miss?" "Of course I am unwell," Miss Johnson snapped, her outburst garnering further attention from those at nearby tables. "I feel positively foul." "Here, darling," Mr. Eddowes spoke softly as he pushed her half-eaten slice of Victoria sponge towards her. "Have something to eat. It may help you feel better." "I shan't have another bite," she cried, and much to his dismay shoved the plate across the table before she gripped the table's edge and turned her wrath upon the waitress. "You must have baked rotten eggs." "No, miss," the waitress began. "I can promise you we don't—" Her words were cut short by Miss Johnson suddenly toppling backwards, however. Both the waitress and Mr. Eddowes leapt forward to catch her, the latter succeeding. Looking at those around them, he cried, "Is there a doctor in the house?" "That's my cue," Dr. Weeks said, stilling himself with another swig of whisky and getting to his feet. Those sitting at the tables around the couples strained their necks and delivered hushed commentaries to their immediate neighbour. Miss Johnson's faint had also garnered horrified gasps from customers elsewhere in the tea room, but even they couldn't pull their eyes away. Upon reaching the couple, Dr. Weeks stepped in front of Mr. Eddowes and delivered several firm taps to Miss Johnson's cheeks. Mr. Eddowes rose at once to lean across Miss Johnson and shield her. "Stop that!" He glared over his shoulder at him. "What do you think you're doing? Who are you?" "I'm the doctor you called for," Dr. Weeks stated, and half turned to drop his cigarette into the vase of flowers in the table centre. Gripping Mr. Eddowes' arm, he encountered a greater degree of resistance than he would have expected when he yanked it away. "And I'm trying to help your friend, so get out of the way." Mr. Eddowes stepped back, and watching Dr. Weeks recommence his tapping of Miss Johnson's cheeks, muttered under his breath, "Americans." "Canadian, actually," Dr. Weeks corrected as he pressed the back of his hand against Miss Johnson's forehead. "Is there a difference?" Mr. Eddowes inquired sardonically. "Canadians are more refined," Dr. Weeks retorted as their eyes met. "Not this Canadian," Mr. Maxwell remarked into Miss Dexter's ear as they joined them. Her cheeks immediately flushed crimson, obliging her to bow her head as she took a bottle of smelling salts from her satchel and passed it to Dr. Weeks. Pulling its cork out with his teeth, he then spat it onto the table and wafted the bottle's contents under Miss Johnson's nose. Within seconds of inhaling the salt's pungent aroma, Miss Johnson was brought out of her faint with a sharp gasp. Despite this seemingly happy event, though, Mr. Eddowes eyed Miss Dexter and Mr. Maxwell with suspicion. "Who are you?" "Just friends of Dr. Weeks. We were taking tea with him when we heard your call for help," Mr. Maxwell explained. Mr. Eddowes responded with a blunt hum, but suspicious glare remained. "Let's get you out of here," Dr. Weeks said as he helped Miss Johnson to her feet. "I'll just fetch your bill, sir," the waitress informed Mr. Eddowes. "You honestly expect us to pay for this poison?" Mr. Eddowes challenged. The waitress's mouth opened, but Mr. Eddowes halted her voice at once by exclaiming, "Don't be ridiculous, woman. The cake made her ill. Look at her." He gestured to the trembling Miss Johnson, who, despite her apparent illness, maintained a healthy pink glow. "I utterly refuse." "If you permit me to fetch the manager, sir," the waitress replied. "You already have my answer." Mr. Eddowes interrupted and picked up his coat and hat along with Miss Johnson's. Mr. Maxwell brought Dr. Weeks' things, which he now proceeded to put on. "Come on, we're leaving," Mr. Eddowes instructed once they were ready. But, sir, you can't," the waitress stuttered with her hands outstretched as Mr. Eddowes strode out the tea room. Dr. Weeks followed, supporting Miss Johnson, who held on to his arm for grim life. Wide-eyed at the sight, the waitress went to chase after them, but was blocked by Miss Dexter, who'd stepped into her path. "Pardon me, miss." Miss Dexter took her hands in hers. "Don't worry." "Miss?" the waitress inquired, confused. "Your manager already knows of this," Miss Dexter replied. Offering a smile of reassurance, she parted company from the waitress to take her place in the pursuit of the others. "Tell him the Bow Street Society was here," Mr. Maxwell instructed the waitress as he passed. Catching up with Miss Dexter by the door, they both then took deep breaths as they crossed his threshold and descended the stairs. Parked outside was a two-wheeler, highly varnished hansom cab. It had both the inside and outside plates and stenciled certificate on its back to show it had passed its examination by inspectors at Clerkenwell. Furthermore, whomever owned it, in this case the Bow Street Society, had paid the 2 shillings for the licence to drive it around London. Further expense the society had incurred was 15 shillings carriage duty to Somerset House, and 5 shillings to the Metropolitan Police for a licence and badge to drive. Though the cab was inspected annually, a cabman's ability to drive was only assessed once. At the end of each year, the cabman took his current licence to New Scotland Yard, who would issue him a clean licence that was valid for a further 12 months. His length of service had to be recorded on the back of his current licence by his employer before he could have it replaced, however. Pulling the cab was a single brown horse, brown being the more fashionable colour and the one most preferred by cab customers. The wheels, meanwhile, were approximately 4 feet wide. Between these wheels, resting upon the axle, was the main body of the cab, a wooden bench within a 2-sided box with a ceiling that also doubled as a canopy over the passengers' heads. The front edge of this canopy was carved into a curved arch, whilst attached to the edges of the left and right walls by hinges were heavy wooden doors with pointed middle sections to accommodate passengers' knees. These, coupled with the wooden canopy, provided some shelter from the elements and from any mud and spray the horse's hooves kicked up. Glassless windows in the cab sides enabled passengers to see where they passed, as well as providing the much-valued free flow of fresh air. Finally, candle-lit lamps hanging from the top corners of the front of the cab enabled passengers to see when climbing into the cab at night. The driver was sitting upon a narrow seat attached to the outside of the cab's back wall, elevated enough so he could see over both the cab and horse. This seat also had iron railings on 3 sides to prevent him from toppling out when the cab was in motion. His broad shoulders were hunched over his calloused hands, which in turn held the horse's reins. These reins ran along the top of the cab, through the hollow tips of a V-shaped attachment mounted upon the canopy's front edge to keep the reins in line, and down to the horse's harness. Aside from his face, the driver's hands were the only other parts of his body visible beneath a heavy black cape. Even his scuffed and slightly torn black leather boots were concealed, though they rested against the back of the cab. Having pulled down the brim of his brown hat to block the low winter sun, He now pushed it back up with a fat thumb as he inquired in a rough voice born from London's East End, "You want a cab?" Mr. Eddowes and Miss Johnson looked up into his brown, beady eyes, which were set deep into his weathered face. Middle-aged, with bushy sideburns, his intimidating appearance was softened by the warmth of his smile. "Yeah, we do," Dr. Weeks replied. "Hop in, then," the driver replied, pulling his hat's brim back down over his eyes and clearing his throat. "Plenty of room inside." Though a cab this size sat 2 persons comfortably, 5 was out of the question. Dr. Weeks therefore perched upon a narrow step at the cab's rear and gripped both the roof's edge and the driver's seat. Meanwhile, Miss Johnson, Mr. Eddowes, and Miss Dexter in turn climbed inside and settled themselves upon the bench. Mr. Maxwell hesitated, however. "Get in," Dr. Weeks ordered. Mr. Maxwell swallowed hard and inched closer to the cab. "Right. Yes, let me see." He hoisted himself onto the cab's edge, thereby causing it to tilt, and held his breath as he slid into the narrow space beside Miss Dexter and the wall. As he dropped down onto the bench, though, he accidentally placed his hand upon her knee and cried, "Oh!" He felt his cheeks burn. "Please forgive me." Glancing at Miss Dexter, he saw her face had also turned crimson. Yet, rather than bring him comfort, it served to increase his embarrassment. Feeling his hip was wedged against Miss Dexter's, he tried to press his body against the cab wall as much as possible. Fortunately, the journey isn't a long one. Mr. Eddowes slammed his door shut, prompting Mr. Maxwell to do the same. Faced with the problem of where to put his hands, though, he searched around before finally deciding to rest upon the door's top edge. The sharp lurch of the cab as the horse trotted forward caused him to fall back, however. His left hand gripped the cab's window at once, whilst his right was dropped to the bench to steady himself. When he felt Miss Dexter's dress, though, his eyes widened as he realised he had no clue upon which part of her anatomy his hand was resting. Yet, to his greater surprise, he felt Miss Dexter's hand not only rest upon his own, but give it a gentle squeeze. "Oh." Mr. Maxwell looked from their hands to her reassuring smile. Thank you, Miss Dexter." "How are you feeling, darling?" Mr. Eddowes inquired. Miss Johnson had her fingers pressed to her temple as she replied, "Foul still. I shall be relieved when we reach the hospital." "We're taking them to the hospital?" Mr. Maxwell inquired, addressing Miss Dexter. "Yes," she replied, trying to use her eyes to warn him against saying any more. "Where else would you be taking us?" Mr. Eddowes inquired as he leant forward to eye Mr. Maxwell suspiciously once more. "Endell Street," Mr. Maxwell replied, only realising his error after the words had left his lips. "Endell Street?" Mr. Eddowes challenged in disbelief. "Yes. You see, Mr. Maxwell stumbled. "What the bloody hell's going on?" Mr. Eddowes demanded and struck the cab's back wall. "You said you were a doctor." "I am," Dr. Weeks shouted back. "Maxwell, keep your damn mouth shut." "But Mr. Maxwell began. "Let us out," Mr. Eddowes demanded as he struck the roof. The driver cracked the whip instead, though, driving the horse into a gallop and sending the cab into a series of violent lurches to the left and right as it weaved through the chaos of London's traffic. Omnibuses, cabs, carriages and vans all sped past in a blur of colours and smells. Faces of pedestrians rushed by the windows as they darted around the cab without warning. One stepped out in front of the horse, only to leap back again. Miss Johnson and Miss Dexter simultaneously covered their mouths and held their breaths at the sight. "Get off the road!" the driver yelled above them. "Are you coppers or something?" Mr. Eddowes shouted over the din. His once refined accent had now degenerated into that of a slum dweller. When neither Miss Dexter nor Mr. Maxwell replied, he reached across the ladies to grab Mr. Maxwell's lapel and pull him as close to him as the doors allowed. Within the gloom of the cab there then appeared the glint of something metallic in Mr. Eddowes' other hand. When he looked down at it, Mr. Maxwell saw the unmistakable shape of a revolver. "If you let us out, I'll have to do something stupid. Don't be thick, Toby," Miss Johnson warned upon seeing the gun. "Put it down." She gripped his arm with one hand and tried to prise the gun from his fingers with the other. "Oi, get off me!" Mr. Eddowes growled. The cab leapt up into the air as it struck something in the road, and as it landed, everyone inside was thrown upward from the bench. Dropped as violently as he was thrown, Mr. Eddowes landed awkwardly, his hand slamming against the door's top edge as a result. He immediately lost his grip upon the gun and it clattered down the door's smooth exterior, struck the horse's galloping hooves and fired. The horse gave a blood-curdling shriek as the bullet lodged itself in its thigh. His leg at once collapsed and the horse toppled sideways at full speed of the remaining galloping legs. The cab, with no way of stopping, collided with the body of the stricken horse, and its left wheel was lifted clean off the ground, whilst its right was stopped dead in its tracks. Everyone inside lifted their arms to shield themselves as the driver ducked. Dr. Weeks leapt onto the road, and the cab flipped and rolled into oncoming traffic. Those vehicles' horses shrieked and tried to rear up onto their back legs as their drivers fought to keep control and swerve out of the way. Yells and screams of pedestrians fleeing for their lives then filled the air when the cab rolled across the road and threatened to mount the pavement. As it struck the curb, though, it tilted forward and fell back onto the road with a loud thud, its wheels spinning and its panicked horse shrieking. Chapter 1. A slender finger lifted the curved brass arms of a W.B. copy holder to free the page of the notebook he had been gripping. This was flipped over the notebook's top and the arms allowed to drop into place. With this task complete, the fair-skinned hands set about commencing a new sentence with a pressing of the improved Salter 5 shift key, followed by a swift striking of the QWERTY keyboard as the notes were transcribed. Within moments, the brief ring of a bell signalled the end of the line, and the typewriter's carriage was released by the left hand before being pushed back by the right. Another high-pitched, yet quiet, bell then cut through the typist's tapping. This one was mounted on the front of a narrow, vertical wooden box attached to the wall beside the desk. The typist plucked the curved lip cylinder from its metallic cradle on the box's side and pressed it to their ear. Speaking into a black cone jutting out from beneath the bell, the typist said, "Good afternoon, Miss Rebecca Trent of the Bow Street Society, Endell Street speaking. How may I help you?" On paper, Miss Trent would have been considered old at 28, yet the youthful rosiness of her complexion, enhanced by a hint of blusher and ruby-red lipstick, often deceived others into believing she was far younger. Corkscrew ringlets of chestnut-brown hair cascaded from her head to hang between her shoulders, with a few strays permitted to frame her face. A tight corset accentuated the slender curve of her waist beneath a long-sleeved, dark and light brown checked top, with dark brown fur trim on the cuffs and squared neckline. Her dark brown, layered cotton skirts had a small bustle at their rear, and hung over her black leather, high-heeled boots. "Ah, hello," a rather pleasant-sounding deep voice replied into her ear. "You say this is the Bow Street Society on Endell Street?" "Yes." Miss Trent rolled her dark brown eyes. Based upon the location alone, the Society's name made little sense unless one knew the significance of Bow Street in the Annals of Crime and Punishment. "To whom am I speaking?" "Mr. Thaddeus Dorsey. I need your assistance, but I can't speak for long. My friend is missing. I'm greatly concerned about him." "I see. If I could have your address, I'll make arrangements for some of our members to call upon you to discuss the matter further." She retrieved a second notebook from her desk and rested it upon the slanted shelf beneath the mouthpiece with a pencil poised. "It's Bow Street, the house with the white door." "What are you doing on that?" a quieter but angry voice interrupted. "I'm not unsafe," Thaddeus insisted, and ended the call with a click. Miss Trent quirked a brow and stared at the earpiece a moment. Putting it to her ear once more, she held the cradle down for several seconds and waited for the operator's voice. "Hello, this is the Bow Street Society on Endell Street. I've just received a call from a gentleman on Bow Street, but the line failed before he'd give me his telephone number. Could you supply it to me, please?" She wrote down the number as it was dictated to her. "Thank you. Goodbye." She replaced the mouthpiece into its cradle and lifted the thick book from the floor beneath. Dropping it onto her desk with a thud, she swept the dust from its cover to read the word phone book and the current year of 1896 printed upon it. Flipping through its 1,350 pages, she scanned the single columns on each for the number. Covering the entire country, the book had a total of 81,000 entries. Eventually, though, she found what she was looking for and placed a sheet of paper beneath the entry to note down the company address. The door struck a chair on the opposite side of the desk, distracting Miss Trent from her task. Seeing Miss Dexter's dust-covered skirts first, followed by her arm, as she attempted to squeeze through the gap between door and chair, Miss Trent stood and dragged the latter away. Leaving it in the corner, she allowed Miss Dexter to enter and cross the compact space to join her. The next to enter was Mr. Maxwell, who, upon giving her a tight-lipped smile, lingered at the threshold with sheepish eyes. "Keep going," Mr. Snyder said from behind him. "Oh, sorry," Mr. Maxwell replied and stepped to the side. Running a heavily scratched hand through his dishevelled hair, he straightened his collar and patted the dust from his coat. Mr. Snyder, unable to find sufficient room within the office for his broad frame, remained in its doorway. He, like the others, had dust covering his clothes, scratches to his face and hands, and tears to his cloak. "What happened?" Miss Trent inquired, having become more concerned by the appearance of each new arrival. "Cab's knackered," Mr. Snyder replied. "How?" Miss Trent's lips parted as she looked between them in disbelief. "And the horse?" "Too hurt to survive," Mr. Snyder replied. Miss Trent gave a sigh of regret. "We've only just had that cab approved." "Yeah, I know," Mr. Snyder replied as his eyes locked upon Mr. Maxwell. "What happened?" Miss Trent inquired, following his line of sight. "Mr. Maxwell?" Mr. Maxwell cleared his throat and toyed with the bow of his cravat. "We watched Mr. Eddowes and Miss Johnson as instructed." "Yes," Miss Dexter interjected as she rested her clasped hands against her skirts and looked to Miss Trent's feet. "And saw them feign sickness just as the coffee house owner's testimony said they had in the past," Mr. Maxwell continued in triumph. "And then?" Miss Trent probed. "Dr. Wicks approached them. He spoke to Miss Johnson and convinced them both to be escorted to Mr. Snyder's cab outside," Mr. Maxwell replied and hastily approached her. "I didn't know he had a gun, Miss Trent, I swear to you." "A gun?" Miss Trent stared at him. "Mr. Maxwell let slip we was bringing them here, and Mr. Eddowes got out a shooter," Mr. Snyder explained. Mr. Maxwell immediately shrank back as Miss Trent glared at him. "Mr. Eddowes dropped it and shot Blue Tie. Dr. Wicks jumped off the back and the cab rolled. We was okay, but Eddowes and Johnson was out cold. Sergeant Bird from Holborn took them in, but another cabby had saw Eddowes holding the gun, so Bird sent us off." "You could have got everyone killed with your stupidity," Miss Trent scolded Mr. Maxwell. "I'm sorry," Mr. Maxwell mumbled, turning aside and rubbing his mouth to soothe his nerves. "But, as it is, you're all fine aside from a few scratches," Miss Trent conceded with a soft sigh as she went behind her desk and picked up a file. "And we achieved what we were commissioned to do, catch the coffee house con artists. The consortium of proprietors will be pleased at least. I'll have the case file sent to Sergeant Bird so he may bring the additional charges against Mr. Eddowes and Miss Johnson." She replaced the file and addressed Mr. Snyder. "Can the cab be repaired?" "Yeah. I'll take Freddie to get it and hire one from a bloke I know. We've got Red Shirt to pull it," Mr. Snyder replied. Miss Trent exhaled and felt the tension dissipate from her shoulders. Good. She held up the address copied from the phone book. "It's fortunate our next commission is within walking distance then, isn't it?" She held it out to Mr. Maxwell, who, taken aback, hesitated before gingerly taking it. "But do anything so stupid again, Mr. Maxwell, and I'll have no choice but to consider the immediate cancellation of your society membership. Understood?" Yes, thank you," Mr. Maxwell stammered. "Whom should we ask for when we get there?" "Mr. Thaddeus Dorsey," Miss Trent replied. "You may encounter some resistance, as there was a second, angrier voice on the line just before Mr. Dorsey told me he wasn't unsafe and hung up his telephone." "So that means he probably is, then," Mr. Maxwell remarked. "No, it means you must investigate further," Miss Trent replied. "Miss Dexter, you may accompany Mr. Maxwell. Mr. Dorsey's friend is missing, so we will need a sketch made of what he looks like to distribute." The two nodded their agreement. "I'll contact another society member to assist you. Wait for them to arrive before you knock on the door, and ensure all three of you return here afterwards to let me know what happened." "We will, Miss Trent," Miss Dexter replied and headed down the stairs ahead of Mr. Maxwell. Miss Trent, meanwhile, turned to a large wooden filing cabinet standing to the right of her desk. It had seemingly hundreds of shallow square drawers which filled the entire wall. She opened one labelled J to L, and it was full of index cards. Flipping through them until she came to the one she needed, She brought it out and copied its address onto an envelope with a black capital B printed in its corner. The B was surrounded by vines and framed by a thick square border. Returning the index card to the cabinet that was then locked, she next typed a brief note and slipped it into the envelope. Once it was sealed, she passed it to Mr. Snyder and the two bade farewell. As he emerged onto the street and hailed a passing cab though, Mr. Snyder didn't notice a figure loitering on the opposite side. The stranger's dark blue eyes watched Mr. Snyder until he had secured his transportation and climbed inside. Whilst he was then driven away, the stranger tossed a lit, hand-rolled cigarette onto the pavement and crushed it beneath their scuffed black leather shoe. Stepping off the curb a moment later, the stranger waited for another cab to pass by before they crossed the road, entered the open doorway, and climbed the stairs. Miss Trent, having returned to her typing, expressed her disbelief at the cab's destruction in the form of incomprehensible mutterings under her breath. She therefore failed to hear the footfalls on the stairs and the soft creak of the door's hinges as it was opened. It was only when she heard the floorboards complain under the stranger's shifting weight that she noticed the shadow cast across the typewriter. She immediately looked up and into the watchful eyes. Recognising the crooked nose and dark red eyebrows which accompanied them, she settled back in her chair and rested her hands upon the desk. "Please sit," she invited. The stranger removed a black trilby from his head to reveal neatly combed dark red hair beneath. He was a man in his early 40s with calloused hands, weathered features, and a well-maintained moustache and beard that matched his hair and colour. At 5'9", he dominated the space. He smiled and, dropping his hat onto the desk, closed the door with a soft click. "How long have you been a member of the Bow Street Society, Miss Dexter? If you don't mind my asking." Mr. Maxwell stepped around a fellow pedestrian whilst Miss Dexter kept her distance behind him. "I don't mind." She kept her eyes fixed upon the pavement in front of her. "It has been about 6 months in all. Do you enjoy it?" "I don't take joy from others' suffering, Mr. Maxwell." No, of course not." He pressed his chin against his chest, deepening his voice. "Perish the thought." Coughing, he slowed his pace to fall and step beside Miss Dexter and rubbed his chest. "I'm not like others in my profession." He frowned. "Might be why I've been an apprentice for the past 3 years. He looked sideways at her, but her eyes remained downcast. "No, what I meant was, do you enjoy the hunt for the truth, the exposure of villains?" "I create sketches." "Yes." He made a downward swoop of his hand. "I know, but those sketches may very well be crucial in identification of criminals and ne'er-do-wells. Also," he turned and walked backwards to see her whole face, "you take descriptions from witnesses to create those sketches. That's a talent in itself." She stopped and met his gaze. Mr. Maxwell, having done the same, smiled with hopeful eyes. Rather than acknowledge the compliment, though, she inquired, "May I see it?" "Pardon?" "The address Miss Trent gave to you. May I see it?" "Yes, of course." He rummaged around in his pockets. "It's here somewhere." Yet, when his hands were withdrawn, an avalanche of papers toppled onto the wet pavement. Crouching, he picked up and inspected each in turn. "Those are my notes. More notes. A fellow's name for reasons which now escape me. Aha! Here we are." He straightened and gave it to Miss Dexter. "Thank you." She read the address and compared its number to that on the house they were standing beside. "I believe we're here." The 4-storied, semi-detached red brick building was the epitome of domesticity. Its oak front door was painted white with a round stained glass window depicting a large yellow flower in its upper panel. Its lower had floral carvings within a circular frame. Above the door was a second squared stained glass window depicting smaller versions of the yellow flower. A scuffed brass plaque etched with the house number, a doorknob and letterbox caught a lantern's candlelight as it hung from a short chain in the porch's centre. The walls of the porch were covered by wood panelling painted to match the door. A set of steep stone steps led to the uneven pavement of Bow Street below. The left and right of the porch were tall, white-framed windows which appeared to fade into the near-pitch blackness of the house's shadow. It was 5:30 p.m. in mid-January, so naturally it was already dusk. Mr. Maxwell gave a polite nod to the lamplighter who was igniting the lamppost they were standing under. The lamplighter looked at him with mistrust, but nevertheless moved on to the lamppost on the corner. Once there, he watched the pair until Mr. Maxwell watched back, at which point the lamplighter lit the lamp and headed toward Endell Street. "I hope whoever it is arrives soon." Mr. Maxwell shivered and wrapped his arms around his chest. "Who does she usually send to these initial client meetings?" "I really couldn't say. Miss Trent sends whomever she feels would be most appropriate." The sound of horses' hooves against the cobblestones then filled the air, heralding the approach of a four-wheeled carriage pulled by a couple of chestnut-brown mares. Painted in black lacquer, with gold leaf adorning its handles and framing its door's central panel, the carriage had the letters P and L intertwined beneath its window. The apparent wealth of the carriage's owner was further denoted by its red velvet curtains and the impeccable uniform of his driver. As the carriage slowed to a stop beside Mr. Maxwell and Miss Dexter, a slender, black, leather-clad hand appeared from behind the curtains and lifted the external handle. Unlatched, the door swung open and a highly polished shoe was lowered onto the metal step before its counterpart found the pavement. As the passenger emerged from the carriage, he was revealed to be a handsome gentleman in his late 20s. His slim face had an unblemished, fair complexion, high yet delicate cheekbones, and a perfectly formed nose. Emerald green eyes, which were at once warm and arrogant, complemented the slight lift of his chin to create an air of superiority. A few golden blonde curls poked out from beneath his brushed black top hat, whilst long, closely cut sideburns lined his jaw. His tailor-made clothes consisted of black trousers and a pristine frock coat, cinched in at the waist, coupled with a maroon waistcoat and a matching silk cravat. He gripped the silver handle of his ebony cane and leaned upon it as he extended his hand to Mr. Maxwell. "Mr. Percival Locke, at your service." Mr. Maxwell blinked as he took his hand. "Not the Percival Locke, the magician at the Paddington Palladium." "The one and the same," Mr. Locke replied. Mr. Maxwell's jaw dropped. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Joseph Maxwell, journalist. That is, I am an, apprentice journalist for the Gaslight Gazette, and this is Miss Georgina Dexter, a freelance artist." "Pleased to meet you, sir," Miss Dexter interjected with a brief one-sided curtsy. Unacquainted with the newcomer until tonight, and unmarried besides, it would have been improper for Miss Dexter to mimic Mr. Maxwell by offering her hand. "As it is my pleasure to meet you, but please, such forms of address are neither necessary nor expected," Mr. Locke replied as he attempted to free his hand from Mr. Maxwell's grip. "Oh!" Mr. Maxwell cried, releasing Mr. Locke's hand. "Sorry." Mr. Locke cast a disapproving glance in his direction. He then ascended the steps with Mr. Maxwell and Miss Dexter behind him. No sooner had Mr. Locke lifted his cane to knock on the door, though, was it opened by a man with short, yet unkempt, dirty blonde hair. He was in his mid-20s with a thin build swamped by the shin-length, dark brown coat he wore. Patches upon its sleeves and elbows covered where the material had ripped or worn away. The stitching was sparse and crude. Stepping out onto the porch, he slammed the door behind him and turned its key. Upon coming face to face with Mr. Locke, he halted in his tracks. "Who are you?" "I am Mr. Percival Locke, and these are my associates." "What do you want?" the man interrupted. Having turned aside to indicate Mr. Maxwell and Miss Dexter, Mr. Locke now looked sideways at the petulant man. "We have been invited by Mr. Thaddeus Dorsey. Are you he?" "No," the man replied. "Is he here?" Mr. Locke inquired. "I've never heard of you. What you want to see you for?" the man inquired, looking amongst them with a constant cold glare. Mr. Maxwell raised his hand. "His friend is missing." "What friend?" the man scoffed. "That is what we are here to establish," Mr. Locke replied. "Mr. Maxwell, Miss Dexter and I are from the Bow Street Society, sir, and you are—" "Jack Colby, Mr. Dorsey's only mate, so you lot can bugger off," Mr. Colby moved, but was halted a second time by Mr. Locke standing in his way. "My good man," Mr. Locke said, "earlier today Mr. Darcy telephoned Miss Rebecca Trent, the clerk of the Bow Street Society, and expressed a desire to enlist our services in locating a friend of his that he was most concerned about. If it is indeed you of whom he was speaking, we should be only too delighted to bugger off, as you put it. Yet I am sure you shall understand when I insist we hear it from Mr. Darcy himself." "Get lost!" Mr. Colby barked, moving forward a second time. Again Mr. Locke stood in his way. "Mr. Colby, we may continue this conversation until dawn, or you could save us all some time by informing us of Mr. Darcy's whereabouts." Mr. Colby glanced back at the door. "If it's another friend that's missing, Miss Dexter can take his description from Mr. Darcy and draw a sketch that we can use to find him with," Mr. Maxwell explained. "Not bloody likely," Mr. Colby sneered. "I can assure you that the Society has more resources than you think," Mr. Maxwell said. "Nah," Mr. Colby barked. "Not likely you'll get a description." "We certainly shan't if you do not tell us where he is," Mr. Locke replied. "Mr. Darcy can't tell you what he can't see," Mr. Colby retorted.